Good afternoon, everyone. Today we will talk about experimental research. First, let's define what experiment is. Experiments provide insight into cause and effect by demonstrating what outcome occurs when a particular factor is manipulated. Pag ginawa natin yung experiment, meron tayong standard. Yung hindi gagalawin doon sa tinatawag nating control group. Sa isang grupo naman, yung sinasabing manipulated, ayun naman yung tinatawag nating experimental group. Pag nag-experiment, meron tayong tinetest. Isang halimbawa niyan ay kung anong mas epektibo, yung conventional or traditional teaching ba, or bagong paraan naman o strategy ng pagtuturo. Experimental research is a study conducted with a scientific approach using two sets of variables. Yung first set ay ang control group, at yung second set naman ay yung experimental group na manipulated kasi mag-i-introduce tayo ng bagong strategy. Meron din tayong tatlong klase ng experimental research design. Ang pre-experimental, true experimental, and ang quasi-experimental. Sa pre-experimental, it is the simplest form for research design. It usually has no control group. Ang gagawin lang dito ay pre-test, treatment, and post-test. Halimbawa, ang dependent variable ay bully students. Ang treatment ay counseling. At ang post-test naman ay observation. Titignan kung may improvement. Sa true experimental naman, participants are randomly designed to either the treatment or the control group. Walang pinipili at walang manipulation. Sa quasi-experimental naman, kabaligtaran to ng true experimental. Kailangan pareho yung grupo. Kung sa example kanina ay about new teaching strategy, dapat pare-pareho yung participants bago magsimula ang experiment. Pareho ang academic status, ang average, and kung ano pa bago mag-implement ng experiment. Ang objective dito ay malaman kung effective ba or hindi. At may possibility din na kapareho lang pala ng conventional teaching ang new strategy.
Independent variable. The independent variable is a manipulation of the environment controlled by the experimenter. Independent variables are selected because an experimenter believes they will cause changes in behavior. When a change in the level, amount of an independent variable causes changes in behavior, we say that the behavior is under control of the independent variable. So the independent variable is the cause. Its value is independent of other variables in our study. So the next is dependent variables. This variable is the response measure of an experiment that is dependent on the subject's response to our manipulation of the environment. One criterion for a good dependent variable is stability. When an experiment is repeated exactly, same subject, same levels of independent variable, and so on, the dependent variable should yield the same score as did previously. So the dependent variable is the effect. Its value depends on changes in the independent variable. So again, the independent variable is the cause. Its value is independent of other variables in our study. And the dependent variable is the effect. Its value depends on the changes in the independent variable. So the next is control variable. Control variable is a potential independent variable that is yielded constantly by the experimenter during the experiment. So the control variable is which the researcher hold constant controls during an experiment. It is also known as a constant variable or simply as a control. The control variable is not part of the experiment itself. It's neither the independent nor dependent variable. But it is important because it can have effect on the results. It is not the same as the control group.
This is the example of control variables. Does red light affect plant growth? So the light color is the independent variable. The plant height is the dependent variable. The water, soil, temperature, day or night time is the control variables. And we always remember that independent variable is manipulated, the dependent variable is observed, and the control variable is constant. Okay, let's proceed to the extraneous variable. An extraneous variable is anything that varies in the context of a study other than the independent and dependent variables. So the effects of extraneous variable is adding variability to the data that is being observed. So these extraneous variables, these are any variables that are not intentionally studied but affects or may affect the results of an experiment. And a confounding variable is an extraneous variable that differs on average across levels of the independent variables. So, the extraneous variable ay nagiging confounding variable kapag ito ay nakakaapekto na sa dependent variable natin. For example, is for the plants, ang independent variable natin ay ginagamitan natin siya ng treatment which is the growth enhancer. And then yung dependent variable natin is hindi natin siya ginagamitan ng treatment. So, for this experiment, there are two groups of a plant which are the control group and then the experimental group. And let's say for example, 'di ba, ang control group ay hindi nakatanggap ng growth enhancer while the experimental group naman ay nilagyan natin ng growth enhancer. So, after a month, we started to measure the height of the two group of plants. And based sa results of the plant, ang experimental group ay siyang mataas kaysa control group. So, ang tanong dito na kung ang growth enhancer ba yung dahilan sa pagtaas ng halaman sa experimental group or mayroon pa bang ibang mga bagay or kondisyon na nakakaapekto sa pagtubo ng halaman? So, ang sagot dito is meron, which are the soil, the water, the sunlight of the sun, the insects, possible na nakakaapekto din yon. So, lahat ng mga nabanggit ko, those are the extraneous variables. Kung napatunayan na sila ang naging dahilan or epekto sa results ng experiment, sila ay magiging confounding variables. How to control the extraneous variables based sa experiment natin. So, the first is we need to control the soil. Kailangan pareha silang pinanggalingan ng lupa. And then the second, the water. So, kailangan pareho yung amount ng water na nilagay natin sa halaman. And then next is the sunlight. So, dapat nasa isang location lang na nakalagay ang halaman. And then the fourth, para mabawasan ng epekto ng mga peste or insekto, maaaring gumamit tayo ng standard pesticides or protection para sa mga halaman. So, kung nagawa ang mga ibinigay na paraan, ay maaari na natin masasabi na ang pagtaas ng halaman ay dahil talaga sa paglalagay ng growth enhancer. There are 4 types of extraneous variables. Number 1, situational variables. These are the aspects of the environment that might affect the participants' behavior. For example, the noise, the temperature, the light condition, and etc. Number two, participant or person variable. So this refers to the ways in which each participant varies from the other and how this could affect the results. So for example, the mood, the intelligence, the anxiety, the nerves, the concentration, and etc. And number three, experimenter or investigator effects. So the experimenter unconsciously conveys to participants how they should behave. This is called experimenter bias. So, for example, the age, the gender, the accent, the manner, and etc. And number four is the demand characteristics. Demand characteristics are all the clues in an experiment which convey the participant the purpose of the research. Control group. So this group is the group that does not receive any treatment nor touched by experimenters. They serve as the basis of what would a person would normally react under natural variable. This control group consists of elements that present exactly the same characteristics of the experimental group, except for the variable applied to the latter. And this group of scientific control enables the experimental study of one variable at a time, and it is an essential part of the scientific method. Next is the experimental group. This experimental group, sometimes called as treatment group, because they are participants that receive treatment, or the things that they are experiencing is controlled by the experimenter. There are two important things that you need to know when you are setting up the experimental group. First, you must know exactly what variable you're going to be testing. Second, you must know how you are going to measure the results from the experimental group. In order to measure the result, you must have some way of making a comparison. By comparing the results from the experimental group with the result of the control group is one way to measure the result you obtain from the experimental group.
How do we assign the participants in experimental research? In probability sampling method, we put three examples: simple random sampling, systematic sampling, and stratified sampling. Sa simple random sampling po is, the population has been given an equal chances of whether they will be put into experimental group or in the control group. Ang perfect example for this is the fishbowl method, kung saan nilalagay natin yung pangalan nila sa isang maliit na papel, then lalagay sa isang lalagyan. After natin ilagay yung buong pangalan nila, ay buong pangalan ng population, bubunot na lang po tayo doon, one by one, on whether they will be put to experimental group or in the control group. Meanwhile, sa systematic sampling, individuals are selected at regular intervals. For example, if you have 100 participants, then pwede nyo pong kunin yung every second person hanggang sa mahati nyo po sila into 50. 50 in the experimental group and another 50 in the control group. While in stratified sampling, the group is divided into subgroups also known as strata, who all share the similar characteristic and often used when we might reasonably expect the measurement of interest to vary between the different strata. For example, the effects of laxative on skinny, fat, and muscular person. In this example po is we are trying to find the differences or different effect of laxative in each body type. That body types are known as strata. For non-probability sampling method, we have the convenience sampling, quota sampling, and judgment or purposive sampling. Sa convenience sampling, it is the easiest method of sampling because we choose the participants based on availability and willingness for them to take part in the experiment. While in quota sampling, it is often used by market researchers where the researchers are given a quota of subjects of a specified attempt to gain data. For example, binigyan sila ng 20 person na kailangan nilang i-interview. 10 for female and 10 for males. And yung 20 na yun is nakadepende na sa kanila kung anong edad yung kailangan nilang interviewin. Whether matanda siya, teenager, or mga buntis, ganun, depende na lang sa kanila. While in judgment or purposive sampling, it is also known as selective or subjective. Because in this type of sampling, the researchers only based on his own judgment as the name implies, and it is the most prone to experimenter bias.
Next, the external and internal validity.
Validity is, can you trust the results of your studies? External validity is general. It is the findings to other populations and settings. Ang purpose din naman ng research is to learn more about the world at large. Hindi lang sa specific group of participants natin or ng laboratory. Ang kaso limited lang naman ang access natin sa small population of participants. So ito ay para ma-explore pa lahat outside ng study. A lack of external validity means that yung findings natin ay hindi maa-apply sa lahat ng tao, kundi doon lamang sa participants na kinuha natin para sa experiment. Example niyan is, if ang participants na kinuha natin ay mga lalaki lang, therefore, it might not apply to women. Or kung magsasurvey ka sa isang population na malayo yung qualities sa study na ginagawa mo. Internal validity relates to the validity of measures within our study. Dito malalaman kung ano yung tunay na cause sa hinahanap mong sagot sa study. A lack of internal validity questions the variables. Kumbaga, hindi pala talaga yun yung nire-reflect nila. For example, yung study mo is about sa ang pag-aalaga ng pets ay makakatulong para sa mental health ng tao. Pero ang hindi pala natin alam ay merong specific type ng pet na makakatulong sa mental health natin. Hindi lang basta kahit anong pet.
And now we have the threats to experimental research. We enlisted 4 of them: history threat, maturation threat, and testing threat, and mortality threat. History threat is the possibility that the observed effects are caused by the extraneous or historical events rather than by the experimental treatment. Ang ano po nila dito is the result of the experiment has been influenced by an extraneous variable. For instance, if the school has an history of having surprise exam after every semester, then the student will have time to prepare to improve their scores rather than using what they have actually learned in the past semester without reviewing their lesson. The extraneous variable in this is that ginamit nila history ng school na nagkakaroon ng surprise exams after every semester. And that extraneous variable has affected the result of the score of the student. While in the maturation trait, a possibility that the observed effects are caused by natural maturation of the subject during the experiment. For example, when the participant can adapt quickly to the treatment, then the treatment that is being used by the experimenter will lose its sense to them because she or he has more intellectual capability than the rest of the subject. While in testing threat, is a threat where the participant can remember their answer on the pre-test and they may tend to repeat them in the post-test exam. When the experimenter uses 2-part questionnaire with the same question, then yung participant na magaling magkabisado is may tendency ulitin niya na lang yung sagot niya sa naunang test dun sa pangalawang test. Then yung ginawa nating treatment sa kanya na kung paano dapat sasagutan yun is mawawala ng saysay. Then for the mortality threat, this refers to the possibility of the subjects dropping out. The participant has the tendency to drop out if the treatment is too hard for them or pag nawalan sila ng motivation kasi lagi nila nakukumpare yung sarili nila sa other participant na nagpe-perform na mas better sa kanya. Ayun po yung mortality threat.